we go. Good afternoon, everyone. You know, it's funny, I was just chatting with one of my colleagues earlier, and I think if we rewind back to 2 years ago at Energy Disruptors, I don't think there was a single talk or panel on data centers. There might have been something on artificial intelligence or ML back in the days, but certainly what I've noticed from the conference over the past few days is just really the theme that data centers and energy demand growth has kind of permeated most of our conversations here today. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Orennia, we're a data and analytics company focused exclusively on the energy transition. So what that means for us is it's about half power and renewables, but it also looks at the decarb space of the energy transitions, whether that's hydrogen, CCS, clean fuels, kind of more broadly. By now, everybody in this room has used ChatGPT. And what this presentation is not going to be on is the potential use cases of AI and its potential benefits, or me trying to predict the next energy efficiency of NVIDIA's Blackwell chip that they have in development. But what I thought was an interesting piece to kind of bring to light in the conversation here today is a far more actionable insight from the back of this data center craze that we're right in the middle of. And so when we're having conversations with renewable developers, infra funds, private equity, what I think is missing from the narrative today is what do I do with this information, right? If there's this wave of demand coming at me from artificial intelligence, from data centers, how should I be positioning my business today to capture the most amount of rent when it comes to the next couple months and years into 2025? So really that's what the theme of today's presentation is, and I have one goal from the presentation today over the next 14 or so minutes, and that's to give each one of you 3 things that you haven't necessarily thought of or heard from other panelists today or yesterday during Energy Disruptors. So keep track. If you don't get to 3, come and grab me afterwards and we can kind of have a bit of a conversation. Awesome. So just to start the conversation, I thought it would be helpful just to remind the audience, why are we talking about AI and data centers at an energy conference? So this is just giving a few different typical energy uses across everything from running an air conditioner for a house all the way through into charging your smartphone. And I've kind of highlighted the different AI use cases there in teal. And what's most interesting to me is if you're anything like me or a lot of my colleagues, ChatGPT has almost become a one-for-one replacement for Google search. And it's actually 10 times as energy intense to just run a specific ChatGPT query. And what's most interesting about that is this just includes what's called inferencing, right? This doesn't include the full host of training data required. And we can kind of get into what necessarily the P&T is on ChatGPT, but really understanding that the energy intensity of AI has really kicked up over the last 2 years. And this is kind of why we're here today talking about it across many different sessions in the conference. So where does this energy go? Well, the basic functions of a data center. About 40% of it goes onto the basic servers. So this is going to be switching on millions of transistor switches to actually process information and bringing that through to the ultimate client. And about 40% of it is actually just cooling the data center as well. A lot of this comes from water-cooled systems. Some of it comes from air-cooled systems. And that's really the bulk of where power goes today. You might have heard the term power usage effectiveness. Really, that's PUE in the data center world. A lot of that is trying to focus on just making sure that that energy component goes to as critical information processing as possible, rather than some of the auxiliary energy sources today. So when we roll this back up to a macro level, why this matters and why we're having this conversation is we've been in a period over the past 20 years of complete flat demand growth. So what we're looking at here, most of my presentation is going to be pretty US-centric in terms of a lot of the data and analytics, but the read-throughs are very similar to North America more broadly. And what we're looking at here is the power demand over the past 20 years remaining largely flat. A lot of that is due to power use efficiency gains, right? Whether that's switching from incandescent light bulbs to fluorescent light bulbs, and a lot of that efficiency gain has kept us at a relatively flat level over the past 20 years, and that's no longer the case going forward. So at Orennia, we predict pretty robust power demand growth all the way into 2050, and roughly 40% of this is going to be coming from data centers, and about half of that is going to be specific to AI in general. So that's what we've got kind of looking at a time where it's really difficult to develop infrastructure and assets to actually get projects through, the interconnection queue, get them built from a power point of view. And so that's why it's really interesting to have this conversation here and today. But more specifically, where are we seeing this data center load growth go, right? I'm tempted to say it's everywhere, although there are a few concentrated hubs. But what we're looking at on the map on the left is basically looking at each dot represents a data center. So this isn't crypto mining. We've scraped out some of those. This is just existing and in development data centers, and they're sized by what their power demand is in terms of megawatts. And what's most interesting is data center site development has always been a real estate play, but now more than ever, it's become a complicated power play because of the size of development of these projects. And the chart on the right, if you take away only one thing from that, is the median size of projects in development have 10x'd from what's in operating right now to what we plan on build. So when you think about a lot of the data center developers that we're working with, the composition of folks that are working at those companies have changed drastically compared to what they were even 3-4 years ago, right? Most of these data center development teams, for the first time ever, are hiring folks that used to work at system operators, ISOs, used to work at utilities, used to work at renewable developers, because the data center site selection process is becoming overwhelmingly dominated by where can I get access to power. So in order of what's most important and most complex to a lot of these data centers when they're thinking about where am I going to go to site my next project, it's overwhelmingly power. And that falls into two different camps. There's, can I pull down power from this specific substation without triggering a crippling amount of network upgrades or delays on my project? So that's the first camp when we talk about power availability, is the grid constraints at that very specific location. And the second component to power constraints is actually far more regional, and that's looking at, well, if we look over the next 5, 10, 15 years, what is the spare capacity inherent in the grid in terms of, can we actually meet all of this in terms of the new supply that we have developing? So that is overwhelmingly driving most of our conversations when we talk about where should we be siting these projects. Other factors to consider is obviously where the fiber is, right? Obviously understanding where water availability is. I was just in a conversation earlier, chatting about why Alberta is actually quite a strong candidate for a lot of data center development, whether it's its access to its cheap power, fiber, and water use. And then finally, other pieces, like it would surprise you the amount of things that these data center developers are thinking through right now. It's stuff like, can I get trained electricians to the middle of West Texas? That's one of the biggest constraints a lot of these data center developers have. And part of it is because there's a bit of that talent rush going on and being able to actually follow through in the logistics of these projects. So when we bring this all the way through into, what do I do with this information? There's a wave of data centers being built. They consume a lot of power. We all understand that. What's the next step that I should be thinking about? Well, what we like to do is put ourselves in the heads of our data center development clients, right? And so thinking about what matters to them most, we made this kind of hierarchy here in terms of what they need is 24/7 reliable power, right? We've been chatting about data centers, and I think for most of this conference as they're one asset class, but they're really not, right? There's everything from hyperscalers to edge data centers to some of the ones kind of specifically focused for AI workloads. All of those different data centers have a completely different profile that they need to consider when they're operating those projects and who their ultimate demand center is. So while I say reliability, there's a bit of a flex in there as well. We've seen a lot of creative structures come up with some of the more flexible data center developers. They're going to the flared gas, whether in Alberta or West Texas, to capture some of that and power some of their data centers. They're going to curtailed renewables across a lot of the wind-saturated regions in the US. And so there's some interesting dynamics at play when that 24/7 criteria isn't necessarily a requirement for a lot of these developers. And then as we make our way up the specific stack, obviously speed matters now more than ever. I think the race to win the AI battle is as strong as we've ever seen. I think you basically saw both Zuckerberg and a number of different other heads of these clean tech companies saying ROI doesn't matter right now. And I think obviously what that means is in the short term, they're looking at speed to deployment because they want to win that compute battle. And I think that is something that can't be understated. The demand for these data centers is absolutely a component of where should we go and site these projects. And then I think making up the way on the hierarchy in terms of, after we have that reliable power, after we've got it online in a quick time period, one of the other pieces is obviously a lot of these tech giants care deeply about, 24/7 zero carbon power, right? And I think there has been a narrative over the past 6 months where they don't care about power, they just want to get projects on. But I would say, I would push back on that. It's absolutely a part of the equation. It's just going to be putting that and horse trading that against other priorities that those projects have. And interestingly, this source of demand, unlike any other source of demand that we've experienced, is price insensitive, meaning it's actually the last factor that they care about. Typically, when we've had power demand growth over those past 20 years, it's actually been driven at the same time that we've had industrial productivity growth, we've had more kind of immigration into specific countries, and so it's been driven by a natural economic driver, and not that a lot of the forces behind artificial intelligence aren't necessarily natural economic drivers, but it's this interesting dynamic where, for the first time ever, cost actually isn't as much of a concern. So with this in mind, what do we see are the winners and losers from this race of data center development? First and foremost, I think a story we know all too well here in Alberta is developing infrastructure is difficult, right? What that means is building out the grid, one of the most complicated man-made machines yet that we've developed. That's going to be very difficult to continue to expand that and grow that from a new transmission point of view. And so when we think about who the winners are there, it's folks that already have assets built with a grid connection and a gas connection today. So what we see when we do a lot of our detailed modeling is folks that own gas power plants are going to continue to win out over the next 5 to 10 years in the form of delayed retirements. So when we model our kind of power market forecast in Alberta as well as in the US, we see around 15 gigawatts of natural gas projects that are expected to delay their retirement at least by 5 or 10 years. And so it's interesting to kind of think about, who are the folks that are well positioned to take advantage of that, right? It's all the way up the value stream from folks like TransAlta, right? Folks like Tenaska, LS Power that have this big operating base of natural gas power projects. We expect them to be the ultimate winner in this result. And make no mistake, that will increase the amount of emissions, all else equal. That's just the reality that we're in today. The other component that we think about is for the renewable developers that we're working with, one of the changes that we've learned from that pyramid is that they value 24/7 power. They also value, the ability of having that dispatchability, and they're price insensitive. So if I'm a solar developer in Alberta, if I'm a wind developer in the US, one of the things I always have to figure out is, should I include a battery with my specific renewable project? And the decision to do that is, does the benefits of including a battery on my project outweigh the costs of EPC and installing that battery? And again, we're very confident that if you look at a lot of the different kind of buyers of this, they'll ultimately roll that into a signed PPA price and cover the cost of those developments. Nuclear is another potential winner that we see in the space. I think we've obviously heard of the 3 Mile Island revitalization announcement. It's interesting, obviously, at the price point of the PPA that was, I think it further confirms the thinking that this is a price-insensitive market. But what's also interesting is it takes a really long time to develop these assets. So again, going back to the middle layer of that pyramid, speed, we see that revitalization of nuclear projects being the most likely to continue over the next 2 to 3 years. But a lot of that depends on what stage of decommissioning are these renewable or nuclear projects in right now. 3 Mile Island was in a safe storage state, which is basically the first step after decommissioning, which is the cheapest to bring that back online. There's actually not that many projects in Canada or in the US that are in that early stages of decommissioning. And so it will be limited in terms of where we see that potential, but certainly for a few projects like the Duane Arnold project in Iowa that was just decommissioned in 2020, we've already seen a number of different companies express interest in revitalizing those. But I think overall, one of the pieces that I get most excited about when I think about this new source of demand that's relatively price insensitive is the ability of taking a lot of these emerging technologies and bringing them down the cost curve for everybody else 10 years from now. So what that looks like is geothermal, advanced SMRs. What it also looks like is stuff like renewable natural gas and biodiesel as backup for a lot of these data centers. I think those industries have been requiring another demand source that's not the transportation sector. And so again, I think we see this as a strong demand source for a lot of those technologies to come down the cost curve over the next 5 to 10 years. So in conclusion, I just want to leave you with one thought, is that there's been a lot of narrative on, is this real? Is this overhyped? And I would just encourage you all to think a little bit past that surface level conversation and say, how should I be changing the actions today to make sure that I'm at the right end of this development as possible, whether you're a oil and gas E&P thinking about your gas versus liquid strategy, all the way down to a renewable developer figuring out where should I put my next solar project. And that's really what at Orennia, what we're trying to help our clients think through is how do I action a lot of this kind of macro themes. So with that, thanks so much for the time.